Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to walk through the first 7 assessments that we will cover in this class. And in this, I will also be highlighting the assessments that I think would be really good choices for you to administer to your focus student. We're lucky that we're starting with language development because these assessments tend to be observational in nature, meaning you're going to watch the student who is asked to do a task or who might be in their naturalistic environment just performing behaviors that they would normally do. These are easier assessments to administer than, say, running records that we'll take a look at later in the semester. So what I have here is the McAndrews assessment forms that are the reproducibles. You can read the copyright down here that says that course instructors are allowed to share these materials with their students. In fact, you have all of these materials already. This is the appendix to your textbook in this class. And this page should look familiar. It's the first page of the long table that appears on page 357 of our textbook. And everything from this point on is in your textbook. It's nice to have PDFs of these things so that when you go into the field to give your assessments to your focus student, you've got reproducibles right here, so you don't need to photocopy or scan your textbook. You can use this PDF and just print off the pages that you want to use. So the assessments we're going to look at this module are the ones that are focused on language development, and there's actually 7 of them that we're going to look at, and I'm going to ask that you give at least one of these to your focus student, and I'll tell you the 1 or 2 that I think would be really good to give, and then you can make your own professional judgment decision based on what you know about your student, what you have observed so far, and the conversation that you can have with your SBTE, the student's teacher. So we're not going to cover the literacy process interview or the interest activity inventories. That was all the focus of our previous work for the student inventory assignment. So we're going to start here with the language observation scale. And you can see the purpose and the age range for this assessment. Then you've got the semantic generative vocabulary assessment. This again is good for pre-K to 12. You can see the purpose of this assessment. Oral presentation assessment, I'm just going to go over that, but it's a little bit out of the range for this class. For some of you in the early childhood program, it's completely out of your certification area. So I'm going to suggest that you do not give this assessment, but we'll still take a look at it. It's there. And then we've got the synonym and antonym vocabulary assessments. We will look at those. They are appropriate for everyone in this class. And then we've got the morphology assessment, both the inflectional morphemes and the derivational morphemes. You can give one, you can give both. This typically you need a student who is at or above the first grade reading level. So if your student is in first grade, probably not going to give this assessment. If your student is in second, reading on grade level, which your SBTE should be able to tell you at this point in the semester, hopefully. If you're not really sure, you could always give this assessment and see what you find. So we're going to take a look at those 7 assessments in this document. So I'm going to go to the first one, which is the language observation survey. Just a quick reminder, all of these assessments are described in detail in the textbook for the class. This one and all of them start on page 78, and that's where the assessments are broken down. There's examples for you to examine and some scoring and analysis information. What you're seeing on my screen are just the forms that you need in order to administer these assessments. So you're definitely going to want to toggle between what's on my screen and what's in the textbook, which I have in front of me, so I'm going to be looking back and forth. So the language observation scale is meant to assess a student's expressive language development. That's their oral or spoken language, especially for those students who exhibit a language difference, a language delay, language processing disorder, or even your students who are English language learners. This assessment is highly recommended to all of you, especially because as you ease into your fieldwork this semester, it's good to start with an observational assessment. And that's because we're going to look at some assessments here in a minute that could raise some DEI red flags for you. We'll look at those in just a second, but this one is really broadly designed so that you are simply watching the student, listening to what they say and do, and writing down on this page your observations. So the observation transcription form, you're meant here to capture notes, record the student's language in what you hear as they're communicating in natural settings throughout the classroom. You should be paying attention to the way that they interact with their peers, the way that they interact with adults in the classroom. Anything that catches your attention, you can write here the notes that you're keeping. This analysis box is really meant for when you're all done. You can write the notes that you have, the analytic notes that you have on the topics that are covered by the scale. So it says here, transcription during any oral communication or assessment where the student exhibited language concerns, write exactly what the student said. And this, kind of like your student inventory, is meant to be like a verbatim quoted transcript of what the student said. It says here, when they exhibit language concerns, we can use this form in this class to just capture any kind of language. It doesn't have to be concerning language. Okay, so let's take a close look at the scale. So this form is meant to help you capture the student's behavior in time, so you're not trying to remember things. But this scale is really where this assessment is what it's all about. So the directions say, after you observe the student's language over time, so you're going to spend a couple of sessions, 3 or 4 visits to the classroom, watching your focus student. You can think about what you've seen with your student inventory assignment. You've already communicated and worked with the student orally, probably. And so pay attention in the next couple of visits. Observe the student intentionally for some of these things. And maybe at this point, you can go through this assessment and you can check off a 1 through 4 rating for some of these things. But the next time you go, I want you to intentionally observe for the things on this assessment. Pay attention. You're going to circle the number on each of the scales that best describes the student's communicative behavior. So on a scale from 1 to 4, we're looking at a 1, almost no evidence of this behavior. Communication was significantly interrupted. So if your student is has so much need in the area of articulation, correctly producing speech sounds, to the point that it is significantly difficult to understand the student, you would mark that student with a 1. If that student rarely exhibits the correct behavior, frequent interference with communication happens, you would give them a 2. If they sometimes exhibited the correct behavior, some interference with communication, you would give them a 3. And if it's predominantly correct behavior that you're observing, there's no interference with the communication, you would give them a 4. So the thing to remember with this assessment is that it really is very much up to you and your opinion how you score the student on this scale. So this is not going to be a norm reference standardized assessment that's going to allow you to compare the results out to other students at this age range. This is really an observational assessment that's meant to help you get some formative data on your student that you can use in the moment or very shortly after to help support your student. In the analysis section, you are meant to describe any areas of strength and specific examples for areas in need of improvement, and then that would get kind of transferred over here onto this cover page, if you will. So we've got articulation, correctly produced speech sounds. We've got pronunciation, correctly pronounced words and did not add or delete sounds. We've got linguistic fluency. Speech was fluent and not disrupted by repetitions, revisions, unusual pauses, and fillers like or like. Remember, when you're giving this assessment, I want you to think about the slides and the lecture on assessing children who speak different vernaculars or accented English. Keep that in the back of your mind. Those comments belong under analysis. So you can write here, student speaks African American vernacular English, which leads to some pronunciation differences. And then you can do, for example, acts. So wherever you're leaving a comment like that, an observational note, you'll want to provide an example, a piece of evidence to support what you're saying. I would not mark that as a pronunciation error. So if everything else in pronunciation is a-okay for that student, but they speak African American vernacular English, you're going to make note of that so that the next person who looks at this data will understand that this is happening, and maybe will also not count it against the student, but you will not take off points for that, especially if it doesn't interfere with your ability to understand what the student is saying. Okay, so I want you to keep in mind all of those diversity, equity, and inclusion pieces that we talked about earlier in this module as you're giving this assessment. I don't want to see mark-offs for students who are speaking Ave. And if you are unfamiliar with Ave, for example, how the copula to be is used, and you notice this in your student, and you're unsure, you've got to do the reading. You've got to educate yourself on the way that vernacular of English is spoken. Okay, this assessment is meant to capture English language learners' performance, so that's a slightly different category. Again, I don't feel comfortable marking them off as they are learning to speak English, but the difference there is that generally students who are learning to speak English as a new language, we are going to provide support. We are going to provide some instruction for them so that they can improve in the way that they use verbs or the way that they conjugate verbs in the English language. The goal for English language learners is to help support them in learning English as a new language. The goal with students who speak African American vernacular English is not to change the way that they speak. We can help them to understand the differences in language, but we are not trying to change the way that they speak. Okay, I'm going to stop lecturing on that. The next category is syntax and morphology. These should sound familiar. These were those systems of language that we looked at in Chapter 3. And here you're looking at their use of sentence and word structure. So they used a variety of long, complex, and compound sentences in the correct word order. They used conjugations, coordinating, which is and, but, or, those connecting clauses. Subordinating, they use the words because, when, unless, etc. as they're speaking. Action verbs, you should know what those are. Adverbs, adjectives, prepositions, correct subject verb agreement. So for example, that would be like they went instead of they. I can't even think of an incorrect way to say that. They. That was a bad example because went is pretty standard across all of them. But the subject that they're using has to match the verb that they choose. I can never think of misexamples when I'm trying to talk about grammar. The copula, again, the verb to be, correct past tense, and irregular verbs. So you might have to look up some of these things if it's been a minute since you thought about these grammar areas, but you should be listening for all of these areas. And there's more past tense using ED. This is another area. If you're working with a student who speaks African American vernacular English, they may have a slightly different use of the past tense. Present progressive using ing, so like going swimming or something that uses that ing with another verb. Use regular and irregular plurals correctly, so fish is irregularly plural as fish. And then use possessives correctly. So that belong to possessives is another thing. So my mom's bike, if they're speaking African American vernacular English, might be my mom bike. So just have an awareness going into this of the things that you might hear students speak and what to be marking as correct and incorrect. And we can talk more about this in class if the need arises. Next is semantics. Remember that semantics is the understanding of meaning, the words that are being spoken. And this category is about their vocabulary and word choice. There's another one down here for meaningful discourse. So using words in the correct context, including question words, using a variety of words, using general academic and content or discipline-specific vocab. Pronouns are used correctly so that the references were clear. Specific terms, instead of saying stuff or things, actually naming things. And then under meaningful discourse, shared meaningful information with listeners, shared information on a variety of topics, explained or described objects, ideas, experiences, or processes in detail using that good expository speech, told stories or events in sequential detail, that good narrative speech, and then persuasive speech describing opinions or convincing others, and then describing feelings and emotions in detail. That's like that social emotional area of discourse. And then finally moving down to the last system, which is pragmatics, their language use, communication of ideas, statements and questions were clearly understood, responding to prompts, taking fewer than 2 seconds to respond when they're given a verbal stimuli, appropriate responses, introducing topics appropriately to get someone's attention, topic maintenance, are they able to keep a topic going or are they constantly changing the topic? And then the opposite of that is, can they change a topic appropriately to help a listener follow their conversation? Are they asking questions for clarification? Do they need repetition or not? Do they respond to requests for clarification? So if the teacher says to them or you say to them, tell me more, are they able to do that? Can they follow simple 3-step instructions? And then can they change their language register for listeners? And this will mean they'll have to listen to them as they talk to their peers, as they talk to the teacher, as they talk to the other adults in the room. Maybe if you catch a glimpse of them with guardians or parents or caregivers, listen for the registers. You can certainly have your SBTE or host teacher sit down with you and rate your student on this scale. It's not expected probably at this point in the semester that you can answer all of these things in great confidence. You can also, let's say, you have not heard the student do any expository speech yet. You can cross off the ones that are not relevant or put an A next to them. If there's any that you simply have not heard or you weren't able to pay super close attention and hear how they use adverbs, if they never say, I quickly ran to get the thing. If they've never used an adverb, you can leave that one out and just put an NA, or not observed would also be appropriate. So you can see there's no final score for this assessment. It really is meant to help you zone in on these different areas of the language systems that were covered in this chapter. And the meat of it is going to come in your analysis notes. In any areas that you think the student really had ones or twos, certainly those would want to be looked at a little more. And if you look on page 78 of the textbook, it says under the analysis section, teacher identifies the student's strengths and needs in the following areas, and they're all the areas of the assessment that we just covered. If the score is a 1 or 2 in any language area or a 3 in several areas of that system, It says they should be referred to speech-language pathologists. We're not doing any referencing in this class. We're not referring for anything. You would want to have a conversation with the host teacher and just bring it to his or her attention that this was an area that you noticed the student could maybe use a little bit more support. Strengths are to be reinforced, and explicit or implicit instruction and modeling should be provided for any of those areas needing improvement. So at this point in the class, we are beginning our data collection. You, as we move through the next several weeks, will be selecting assessments to administer, giving them to your student, collecting your data, and starting to think about the areas where you might want to focus your intervention instruction. That is the end goal of this class. You're going to collect some data, figure out what the student needs, and then plan and teach the student some intervention instruction that will help him or her. So if this ends up being an area that you want to teach the student and do some instruction, some intervention support, this data is going to help you in that process. So you're going to want to make sure your analysis sections are very detailed and clear, and that all of the scores you can possibly collect are noted. Okay, so that is the first assessment option that you have. I highly recommend that you give that assessment. I think it's a really good one for all students, and it allows you to be inclusive of the many things that we're looking at in this class. Okay, the second assessment is called the Semantic Generative Vocabulary Assessment, and this one is designed to identify students' ability to name multiple items in a category, to describe the whole part relationships between things, to describe objects, to describe feelings and events. So in order to give this assessment, the teacher's going to read each prompt that you see on the page to the student and write down, and it says you can also audio record. You can only audio record if you have permission, but you can audio record their responses. So for each question, the teacher's going to say, I'm going to ask you some questions. I want you to answer with as many words as possible. Then you give the student up to 2 minutes to respond to each question. If they stop, you can ask, can you tell me more? And after 10 seconds of no response, you can go on to the next question. So this is an assessment where you're going to want to have your little timer, your cell phone timer out, or your smartwatch timer out, or your analog old school watch, so that you can keep an eye on the time. This is a timed assessment. They get 2 minutes for each response, or if they meet the highest level by then, 10 or more correct, you can of course move on to the next one. To differentiate this assessment for English language learners, they should be asked to respond to each question first in their native language and then in English. If you don't have the luxury of having an interpreter or a translator or understanding the student's first language, that might not be a great option this semester. But if you do have students who speak English as a new language in your future classes, that's a thing that you want to make sure you're able to do. And in that case, you probably would want to translate the questions as well. So to score this assessment, for every prompt, you're going to mark a plus sign, as it says here, for 10 or more correct items or concepts. And this would be the appropriate level or advanced, as you can see down here, the advanced level. So name as many kinds of foods as you can. So they get 2 minutes and they're going to list off, pizza, spaghetti, whatever. They're going to list off foods. Once they get up to 10, they're going to get a plus sign, and that is considered appropriate. Then you're going to move down to 5 to 9 correct. Those students are going to get a check mark. So choose one food and describe it in detail. So I choose pizza, and I say pizza has crust, has cheese, has sauce, has pepperoni. It's delicious, and I'm done. I've only given 5. I would get a check mark instead of a plus. That is an adequate response. And then a minus sign is for 0 to 4 correct items. This is considered limited in the response. So name as many kinds of clothing as you can: shoes, socks, shirt, pants, and that's all I can come up with, I would get a minus. What kind of clothing go together and why? Name the parts of a car, which is actually, for the record, kind of hard. If I tried to list 10 of them, I might have a hard time. A car is a kind of transportation. Name other kinds. Describe a person you know. Tell me what that person looks like, acts like, and does. Describe a day in your life. Tell me what you did and how you felt. So you're going to continue reading all of those items. For every response, describe the use of interesting or specific terms. I would say write down as much as you can of what they say. Try to capture their responses here in the white space area. Try to write down everything that they have said. It says to try to capture multiple categories, different parts of speech, and then it refers you back, interestingly, to the language observation scale. And that's probably to remind you that there's morphology, semantics, syntax, all of the different language systems can be in your consideration here. And then when you're all done, 6 or more pluses in these 8 boxes will be considered advanced. 5 or more pluses is considered adequate. That's where you generally want your kiddos to land in adequate. And then 4 or fewer pluses or checks will be considered limited, has a limited semantic generative vocabulary. And then there's an analysis section where you're going to write the overall findings that you have. So this is a great assessment. Again, it's kind of open-ended. It gives the students some talking points. If you do have English language learners, I highly agree with the text where it says translating this might be really helpful to them. The next one we are going to skip in this class, it's the oral presentation assessment. It kind of has to go with an assignment that you give the students to do. Basically, they have to come up with a presentation and they have to present it, and you're going to score them on all the things. This doesn't start until typically 3rd grade. As the assessment says. So it's here for you. You're welcome to use it in your teaching. You can even try to do it this semester, but I would say skip that one. The next one is another really good one to give, and I would recommend that you give this one to your focus student, and this is called the Synonym and Antonym Vocabulary Assessment. So the one we're looking at here is synonyms. There is one on the next assessment that's called the Antonym Vocabulary Assessment. So synonyms, of course, are words that mean the same thing or super similar, and antonym, of course, are words that are opposites or mean completely different things. So I'm going to show you this one because I'm here now and I don't want to keep scrolling. But these 2 tests are considered screening instruments, and they're used to identify reading and listening vocabulary levels for students in all grades. And it's actually broken up by grade level. As you can see here, level 1 loosely translates to the 1st grade. So 1st graders would take this level. 2nd graders, you would give this level. 3rd graders, 4th, and all the way on up. And in fact, it starts to get grouped together when you get to 7 to 9. That would be roughly your middle school, junior high level, and then 10 through 12 would be for your upper level students. So this one goes all the way up to high school. So going back to this page, we can see the procedure. Either of these assessments, the synonym or antonym vocabulary assessment, can be administered to whole groups or to individuals as a reading or listening assessment, depending on the teacher's purpose and the student's reading levels. They should be administered separately, though. So once you give the synonym assessment, you should pause for a little while and give the antonym assessment later. If students are able to read at the 2nd grade level, the teacher can begin by administering each test as a reading assessment. Otherwise, it should start as a listening assessment. So essentially what they mean here is whenever you're giving an assessment that's leveled like this, it's always good to start one level below where the student is currently in school. So if you had a second grade student reading on a second grade level, you would start this assessment on the first grade level, and that's so that you make sure that you capture their actual functioning level. So if they are in second grade, there's a chance that they're going to miss some of those words on that second grade list, but they should be able to get all of the first grade words. That also gives them a little bit of confidence as they start, because the assessment should be easier for them. It does say too, if you're working with a first grader, that you should start this assessment as a listening assessment. What's nice about it is you can give it as a reading assessment, where you say, read each line of words, draw a circle around the word that means the opposite of the first word in each line, and you would continue that until the student reaches their frustration level, which is missing 7 or 8 of them, or becomes frustrated themselves using nonverbal cues there, and then repeat that grade level by having them listen. So if you're doing the reading assessment, those are the directions. You would start by having them read, and then you would do it again anyway by saying them out loud. So the listening directions are, say to the student, follow along as I read the words in each line, draw a circle around the word that means the opposite of the first word in each line. You could have them doing that. You could do the circling for them if they just tell you. And then the scoring and analysis, they get a plus sign if they get the correct one, a minus sign if it's incorrect. And for each level, you're going to write the functioning level, total correct, and the percentage correct. So the practice item can show you here, you're going to say, again, let's say we're doing the reading one, read each line of words, draw a circle around the word that means the opposite of the first word. So stop, boy, go, her, look. The opposite of stop is go. I would circle that one. And so that would get me a plus over here. So it's either plus or minus. Those are the score options. And then for this, you're looking for the level, the functioning level for the student, and that is shown to you here on this line. So a student who's able to get 90 to 100 on this, or 9 or 10 correct, is at the independent level. That means that all of these words on this grade level, this functioning level for them, is an independent. They can come up with an opposite in vocabulary. Instructional level, that's where the student's sweet spot is. That's where you would come in with some teaching to support them and push them and make sure they're improving. This is that typical level where we want all of our students to be. That's if they're getting at least 7 or 8 of the words correct. And then frustration level is going to be 60 or below, which is 6 or fewer correct. And that means that that level of vocabulary for that student is too hard for them. So if you are assessing your student on level 2 and they reach that frustration level, you've got to drop down to that level 1. So back to the text on page 81 of the textbook, it says that the reading assessment should begin at level 1, which equates to first grade, for all students at or below 4th grade level. Otherwise, it should begin at least 3 levels. Oh, this assessment says below, to begin 3 levels below a student's grade level to capture their true functioning ability. Students will continue with each level until they score a 60 or below. So you're not just going to stop at their level. If they get 9 out of 10 on level 1 and they're in first grade, you're going to go up to level 2. And if they still get 7 or 8, you're going to move up to a level 3 until they score a 60 or below. So you're going to continue to test out for this assessment. That level is re-administered. So students will continue with each level until they score 60 or below. That level, where they score 60 or below, then gets re-administered as a listening assessment with a different colored marker or pen, and again continues going up and up and up until they get 60 or below on the listening. So it's a slightly different way of administering this assessment. Okay. So you'll always give the practice item first out loud and explain to the student. The practice item on an assessment is there for you to show the student how the assessment works so that there's no confusion for them and they don't miss items because they just didn't understand the assessment. If the student doesn't understand the practice item, you have to keep explaining in order for them to understand how the assessment works, and don't move on until they truly understand. So throughout each assessment, in front of each line, you're going to write a plus sign if correct, a minus if incorrect, and then calculate the total and the percentages, which is nice and easy because they're both out of 10, and that's how you get the functioning level of the student. It is also good on this assessment to give them an index card if you're going to have them look at this scoring sheet. It's also good for you to have your own copy. You could also just copy the table for them if you wanted to, or blow it up and make it a little bit bigger. Those are all helpful tips if you're giving this assessment, and we'll practice this in class the next time I see you. The highest grade level that the student scores 70% is considered the student's reading or listening vocabulary, depending on which one you gave. So if they've got a 70 or above, that's considered on the highest one, that's considered their reading or listening vocabulary level. Teachers should identify whether the student's reading vocabulary is below, at, or above their current grade level. So this assessment is nice because it can tell you by grade level if they are where they need to be, if they're above, if they're just below. If the student's vocabulary is below grade level, the student reading vocabulary, then the student's listening level should also be assessed. And students who score below their grade level might need some more attention to vocab development. And that's where you would go out and find some good intervention. These assessments, the synonym and antonym vocab assessments, are also two really good ones to give to your student. They will be fast, they will be easy. You could give them in probably 5 minutes, both of them at the same time, without much difficulty. Okay. Again, we'll practice these in our class together. The next one we're going to look at is another sort of 2-in-1 assessment, and this is the inflectional morpheme morphological assessment. So this one starts on page 82 in the text, and this is to assess the ability to create words by adding inflectional morphemes to root words, to pluralize nouns, to show possession, to change a verb's tense, or to show a comparison without affecting the root's meaning or part of speech. This is really good for students in grades 2 through 12. So if you're working with a first grader, this is not going to be a good choice for you because this will be slightly out of their ability level. If you're working with a second grader who's maybe a bit below or behind the curve of the class, this is probably not a good assessment either. If you're in a third grade class, this would be a good one to give. So the procedures for this one, the assessment can be read to a student who responds orally, or the student can read it if they're a bit older and write the correct word. So the teacher starts by saying, I will read a key word and a sentence with a blank. Fill in the blank by adding suffixes or word parts to the key word to make the sentence complete and sound right. The teacher then gives the practice item. So the practice item is up here, and it is dog. I have a dog. I used to have 2. And the correct word is here, dogs. So you would give that item to the student. If they don't get it right, give them the correct answer, explain it, help them to understand why that word is the correct choice. So as you go, you're going to write down the total correct out of 16. This is kind of a right or wrong assessment. And then describe the type of morphemes that the student correctly said or did not say, and give examples of incorrect responses. If your student speaks African American vernacular English or another vernacular of English or dialect of English that impacts the way that they inflect on morphemes. For example, Sam has 1 cat, Anne has 2 more cat. Sometimes in African American vernacular English, they may leave that S off. Down here for possessives, my sister has a fish. My sister fish is a goldfish. You will commonly hear that in Ave. this would not be a good assessment to give them because they are likely to miss many of these items because of the vernacular that they speak. So if you have a student speaking Ave, I do not recommend this assessment. Unless that is you want a record of like it's helping you to understand the vernacular that they speak to give this assessment, and you simply want a record of the ways that they change the inflectional endings of words, that would be okay. Here's another one. Verb tense. Yesterday, Max play with his truck. In Ave, they would simply say Max play with his truck. So this is a DEI alert. That yellow slide should be flashing in your mind. I do not recommend this one if you're working with a student who speaks Ave. Going back to looking in the text to make sure I didn't miss anything. Going back to the text on page 84, it will tell you same thing for this assessment, not recommended if your student speaks Ave unless you want to use it simply as a record for the discourse patterns that they have. For this one, you're assessing their ability to create words by adding derivational morphemes to root words to change the root's meaning or the word's parts of speech. This assessment, this is good for grades 3 through 12, so most of you will not be giving this assessment because you are not working with children that old. If you have a student who needs to be challenged in this area, who seems to be bored with what they're doing in school, who's accelerated or could be gifted or talented, this would be a great assessment to give them. This can be read to a student who responds orally, or you can have the student read it and write the correct word. Teacher will say, I will read a keyword in a sentence with a blank. Fill in the blank by adding to or changing the root word to make this sentence complete and sound right. And luckily for these two assessments, it has exactly what you need to say at the top. Then you would give the practice item, which is test. Before our test on Friday, we will have and the correct word is pre-test. So they have to understand the meaning of that sentence and how to change that root word in order to add the prefix pre to make it make sense for pre-test. So you're going to write the total correct out of all 20 of the words, and then you should describe the type of morphemes that the student got correct, or the ones they couldn't say, or any examples of incorrect responses should be noted. Okay, and so this one would only be appropriate if you've got a more advanced student. Probably most of you will not be giving this assessment. That is all the assessments that fall under the language development category that we're going to take a look at. I would like you, out of these 7, to choose one assessment that you absolutely know you're going to give to your student in class. And in this class. And what we're going to do this week is you're going to get into groups with others who think they want to give that assessment. Oral presentation is off the table. Do not pick that one, please. But the other ones, you're going to choose which one you really want to give. Those of you who choose the language observation scale, I'm going to have you watch a video of a student in his naturalist environment in the classroom, and you're going to give this language observation scale to that student. You're going to just observe him. And then the rest of you will be giving these assessments to each other. And if we've got enough time, it would be great if you came with 2 assessments in mind that you want to try. We can run 2 cycles of this where you get to try a couple of them. And the goal for that is simply that I want you to be able to get some practice before you go out and have to give these assessments to a live human being child. So please come ready with a couple of assessments in mind that you think you want to give out in your field placement, and we will practice. And then the second part of class, we will talk about what to do with a student who shows that this is an area of need for them. If you have students who need language development support, we'll talk about ways to support them. Okay, looking forward to this conversation and seeing what you all choose for your focus student.